are accusing Russia of planning to release a faked attack video to use as an excuse to invade Ukraine. Could this work? NBC News Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel.
This fake attack, we believe that Russia would produce a very graphic propaganda video, which would include corpses and actors that would be depicting mourners.
The Kremlin calling the accusations false. Meanwhile, U.S. troops are heading to Eastern Europe. Here's NBC's Kerry Sanders.
Today, 1,700 plus soldiers with the 82nd Airborne loaded up and shipped out to Poland, which shares a border with Ukraine. They were given less than 18 hours to get ready, say goodbye to their families, with no indication of when they'll be home.
The Pentagon calls the deployment temporary.
And new this morning, Russia and China have signed a joint statement on calling on NATO to halt its expansion, calling on the West to, quote, abandon the ideologized approaches of the Cold War. Reuters reports the statement issued during Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to China for the Winter Olympics also said Moscow fully supports Beijing's stance on Taiwan and opposes Taiwanese independence in any form. The meeting is Chinese leader Xi Jinping's first face-to-face engagement with a foreign leader in nearly 2 years. Richard Haas, let's start right there. What are the implications?
All sorts of things. In terms of China and Russia, essentially you have this kind of authoritarian, anti-democratic international. Russia doesn't much like what's going on in Ukraine, not simply because of NATO and the possibilities there. They don't like the example that Ukraine sets. They don't like the content. They don't want anyone in Russia getting excited about Ukrainian democracy. China looks at Taiwan. Again, they don't much like the example that Taiwan sets. Both of them want to have freedom to use force to create spheres of influence in their parts of the world. So there's some real parallelism there. And what they agree on is they don't much like anything the United States is about. And they are increasingly banding together. Russia also provides China a lot of the energy it needs. So they have found common cause. So it's no surprise that Vladimir Putin shows up at the opening of the Olympics, which for Xi Jinping is a major opportunity to say China is back. We have gotten on top of COVID, even though they have not. We can talk about that if you want. But this is a real sign that these two countries have essentially forged, I wouldn't call it an alliance, but common cause against the United States. They have found lots that they agree on and lots that, in a sense, they jointly are against.
And Richard, what do you make of the report about this so-called staged attack where Russia could then claim that they were invaded? Is this possible, and where does it come from?
Yes, it's possible. And Mika, think about it. It's consistent with everything Putin's done. He manufactures this crisis. He puts north of 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border, and he tries to portray Russia as the victim. That Russia is somehow reacting to events and he has no choice but to do things. So this is the latest kind of potential trigger. What's really impressive here, and I think the administration deserves some points, is we are getting ahead of the Russian time and time again. The Brits did it the other day, of the information game. We're finding out stuff that they're cooking up. It's preposterous, but we're getting out and we're essentially exposing it. So we're reducing the ability of Russia to use these things as pretext. So this is interesting, you know, and think about it. In recent years, Russia's been very good in the information space with cyber, and we're beginning to see that the United States and the UK, our joint intelligence capabilities are catching up, and we're in some ways denying them the ability to create the pretext they want. Doesn't mean they won't invade, because they just, you know, if they want to invade, they will, and that's really still the larger issue. Are we doing enough to deter them? And again, here, I think the thrust of U.S. policy over the last couple of weeks has been very good. I don't think Putin counted on the kind of response he's facing, militarily, diplomatically, the threat of sanctions. I think we've wrong-footed him, and that, to me, explains why they keep looking for new things to introduce here.
At least depending on the day, depending on who you ask, Putin's either going to invade, he's not going to invade, he's going to wait for the Olympics to be over, he's going to use the Olympics as cover, as a distraction to go in. Has the calculus changed for him, do you think, over the last week, watching what President Biden has done, watching what the West has done, watching what Europe has done? Biden talked about moving 3,000 troops into Eastern Europe, for example. Do you think Putin's looking at this differently now than he did, say, a month ago?
I still don't see what the face-saving move for Vladimir Putin right now is, to not invade. And that's what I'm concerned about, Richard. How is there a way for this to de-escalate that Putin still saves face, which is we know what he needs, and this is ideological to him, whereas we know that the American public is not going to be necessarily supportive of going into Ukraine.
Look, I think he's got three options. One is he could take some of the diplomatic things that are being offered to him in the way of arms control, new talks in Europe, pullbacks of certain kinds of forces. Two, he could do something almost parallel. He could say, you're going to put forces up in my backyard. I'm going to reintroduce some forces in your backyard. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? Maybe with bombers this time. He could do something like that. Thirdly, he could do the so-called minor incursion. Some kind of a smaller intervention, not with 100,000 troops, grab a little bit more land in the east of Ukraine, something like that. And he could basically say, if I do something small, the Germans and the Americans will not be on the same page. The sanctions I will then...
There's this angle. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi warned American athletes competing right now in Beijing not to use these games as a venue for protest.
I would say to our athletes, you're there to compete. Do not risk incurring the anger of the Chinese government because they are ruthless. I know there is a temptation on the part of some to speak out while they are there. I respect that, but I also worry about what the Chinese government might do to their reputations, to their families.
Wow. The U.S., among several other nations, has enacted a diplomatic boycott of the games, citing China's human rights abuses. Richard, what do you make of that? What do you make of Speaker Pelosi's comments?
I understand that where she's coming from. I respectfully disagree. Yes, it's going to be risky for athletes to say something, but let's be honest. This Olympics takes place against the backdrop of massive repression in China. The United States government has termed it genocide. It's clearly a crime against humanity. Now, China doesn't want these Olympics to get undermined. So I actually think there's a bit of deterrence here. I think they're going to think twice before they take actions against athletes, because then you could have a massive